This is one that Rob brought up, and this was based on a piece on Gamasutra regarding more developers supporting retro games. I know we did a podcast a few months ago with Mega Cat Studios, a studio that basically completely specializes and are built around modern retro games and even doing kind of those backwards ports to NES, TurboGrafx, I think Sega Genesis as well.
Yeah, I actually remember listening to that podcast. That's super interesting stuff for me.
Yeah.
I am so impressed by developers who do that, and the curious about the drive that makes them do that.
hmm And it is a very interesting market to say the least. Because I know we've talked about this before, but we've certainly seen independent developers embrace modern retro design. Again, Yacht Club games being Yacht Club and Loco Malito being two of the most standout developers on that front. But going back to support older games or older consoles is definitely a very weird thing, I think, in today's market. Because we've talked about backwards compatibility and trying to preserve video games, and these developers are certainly trying to keep that art alive. What do you think about it, Rob?
It's really interesting. I mean, I will say I've been getting the itch lately to. Just the other day, it just occurred to me I wanted to play Monkey Island, The Secret of Monkey Island again. It's a game I really enjoyed when it came out, and I beat that one and the second one without any hints, and I was so proud of myself for that in that day and age. And just been getting the itch to play that again, and getting my PS2 out, playing some old Final Fantasy, and just debating whether or not I should get it on a new console or just play the one I have, like get it on mobile for $15 a pop, or just play it on the PlayStation that I already have. It's a tough one because I can only be in one location playing it on PlayStation, but whatever. But yeah, having someone who goes back and actually makes a game on that console for that console, and you can't get it anywhere else, kind of like a musician recording only in vinyl. It's interesting and intriguing. I know the concept of working on older systems has been around since the first generation, the second generation of any system. But it's just fascinating, the reasons why you'd put yourself under those constraints, and is it specifically intellectual, or is it about having that kind of old game console feel that you just want to capture yourself? Like it's very interesting to me to see what a person's reasoning behind that would be.
hmm And as you said, the other big challenge, of course, is actually marketing these games, because that a game like this is not going to be turning out Call of Duty, Fortnite profit in any conceivable future.
Yeah.
But I do think, like when I spoke with Megacat, that there's definitely a lull for these kinds of games, and the fact that you really don't see them around anymore is a huge reason for it. And from what they were saying, there's still very much a big second-hand market for this kind of retro games. Like there are people who will sell, I'm not sure we would call them knockoffs, but I guess unlicensed NESs, controllers, the wires, and all that. And I think what he was saying was, as long as you don't actually say that you are Nintendo, Nintendo doesn't care. You can release a bootleg Nintendo-looking controller, call it a Josh Tendo, and as long as people know it's not from them, they're fine with it. Hey, Mike, thanks for coming on. Yep.
Yeah, hey Mike. No, it is interesting. There was I had mentioned to this to you just before we started. In Portland, I lived there a couple of years, about 2.5 years, and they have this terrific retro games show. And you'd go there, and they just have tons, like dozens and dozens of arcade machines set up, and pinball machines, and that's where they, at least those couple of years, hosted the Tetris World Championship. And it's just a lot of fun. And then half of the convention is vendors, and many of whom, well, certainly they sell retro art, retro game art, and but many of whom design games for these old systems, the NES, the Genesis, the Atari 2600 and 5200, and or is it 5400? I forget. And the Intellivision and ColecoVision, and just all of these systems that you've forgotten about. As someone at my
Mm-hmm.
age has even forgotten about, and certainly a lot of younger folks just aren't really familiar with at all. Save the
Mm-hmm.
Atari and Nintendo, and the Sega, the famous ones, or the ones that stood the test of time, I should say.
Yep.
But there are just, well, to say there are tons is an overstatement, but there are more than I ever imagined, people who are making these games. And certainly, you guys touched on this in your podcast,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you're going back to a physical medium and you have to
Yep.
produce cartridges.
Oh yes, that was one of the more interesting things when we had that conversation with MegaCat. That they do all the cartridges, the soldering of the um, computer boards, which again I'm sure I just butchered that for every programmer watching. They print the manuals, they do the box art, they do all that in house. And again, that is such a strange concept for I think people today, or gamers like the last 5 to 10 years, to understand. It reminds me again when I did that presentation about the arcade industry, and this girl in the audience was like, "What's that thing? That's a dial-up modem. You can't go on the internet, play video, and use a phone at the same time." And she thought I was just talking about the magic of that I'm casting them a witch, describing some strange thing there.
Oh, I couldn't even imagine if, like, I remember when it was such a big deal that you could have two apps open on your phone at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, and how crazy it was to even consider something like that
Mm-hmm.
back in the olden times,
Yes.
the before era, as I would start to call it. But like, yeah, you put yourself under these severe restraints,
Mm-hmm.
and you think of it as only technological. But then you start to realize that back then all you could do was buy physical media. And
Mm-hmm.
so to go back to that part where you have to create cartridges and actually physically hand someone your product,
Mm-hmm.
is just, it kind of blows my mind. I mean, it is taken the retro games concept and just taken it that one step beyond, where you limit your audience only to those who actually own a console from back then, or a new version of that console.
Yeah. And that's where things get very hard, I think, to try and make that more mainstream. Because we've seen developers like, excuse me, like Joy Mashers, again, Local Molito, who are making games for the PC, but they look very much like those old style games. But you can still buy them on, Steam, Humble, and on their own websites. But I know MegaCat, they do release PC or modern versions of their games. And I remember on that podcast, he did talk about how they have to, again, try and make things work. Like they can't do everything on the PC version that they can do on the NES version, and vice versa.
Yeah, and I gotta say, one of my favorite things to experience is someone taking a modern game
Mm-hmm.
and trying to cram it into a 2600 or a NES, a Nintendo system, which it's just, you have to really abstract the concept of whatever you're doing, whether it be like a Fallout version of, a NES version of Fallout or something crazy like that. That's some of my favorite things to watch and just try and interpret as I play.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of when I saw like people. Like, I think I saw people do demakes of a lot of modern games. I think I remember seeing one a Left 4 Dead demake like a few years ago, which was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that stuff is very intriguing to me because I just, I have a lot of, I reminisce often about playing those old consoles, and just as a kid, being in the, just immersed in the 80s, and just all of the stuff that the 80s represents all over the place. Oh, the tape player, Mike. Yes. I had an Atari 800, and yes, we had a tape player as well. Jumbo Jet Pilot was the game, and I just remember wrestling with that thing. Uh, Kids in my day, and I'm imagining in yours, had probably got more technological training just trying to run the game they want to run on their limited systems back then. Nowadays, it's a little bit more straightforward. But yeah, playing some of these old games in those times, I mean, that's what calls me back. So seeing a younger person do that is interesting to me, and I just wonder how that comes about.
Mm-hmm. I remember again. Everybody remembers blowing on the NES cartridge to make sure that it works. And I remember the joys of trying to get DOS to get games to work
Oh
on
my
that.
God. EMM 386. So
Yeah. I am really glad we moved away from DOS. That's one of those things I'm just happy we never have to experience again. Like dial-up modems.
yes, dial-up modems. It's oh my God. Just I mean, it really is. It's just taking your if a modern console is just a Swiss Army knife of
Hmm.
things you can do, then trying to go back is like basically taking all of the blades off and just using the plastic cup case to do something with.
Hmm. And now smartphones are probably like 800 times more powerful
Oh my
than
gosh.
everything that came out the last 20 years.
I feel like that's even understating it, but
Hmm.
it is. It's just interesting because you see retro games on a PC, and
Hmm.
I'm a big fan of that, and a lot of
Hmm.
indie games go that route. But the fact is that those games are still like minimum might be 30 megabytes, right? And
Hmm.
that's just insanely like the number of disks you'd have to put into your computer to equate 30 megabytes back in those days is ridiculous.
Hmm.
I am interested though, and I think now this talk is inspiring me to go out and buy some old consoles and start to support that passion out there for doing this.
Hmm. I just love that we're complaining about 30 megabytes of a game when we probably both have downloaded games like 800, like 10 to 15 gigs probably over like the
Oh my
last two
God.
weeks.
I have a 60 gigabyte game on my system, and I know like some of the others get up to insane amounts, 80 or 100 gigabytes, and to say that's insane now, fast forward 10 years, and you're like, what? They only 80 gigs? What? That's nuts.
Uh huh. And
How do you make a
again,
game with only 80 gigs?
and as we were saying earlier, Final Fantasy 15 it needs at least 100 gigs to run.
Yeah,
Let's see someone demake Final Fantasy 15, make a Atari version of that.
yeah. It's just basically Final Fantasy one, but you just have a car, and that's the whole game.
Mm-hmm.
Driving around in your little car.
Mm-hmm. Oh my god. And yeah, that's always a strange thing. It's a great tangent, a great companion as we were talking about with computer parts. I mean, I bought this computer that I'm running now. This was about 9 years ago, 9, 10 years ago that I started collecting the parts for it. And back then, again, 10 years, it seems like, we're talking 80 years, that was considered like next level stuff when I bought that. Like, when I bought like 6 gigs of RAM, that was considered, oh my god, why do you need 6 gigs of RAM to run games? That's crazy. Nobody's going
Yeah,
to ever beat that. And now the new computer I'm looking at is going to be at least, I think I'm going to get like 30 or 32 gigs of memory. And who knows, probably in another 10 years from now, we're up to 150 gigabytes of memory as well.
yeah. I mean, it's just that I forget the name of the law where it's just it doubles every so often, every couple of
Mm-hmm.
years, and it's just it is hold relatively true, and it just continues to do that. I know processor speeds and stuff has been a
Oh,
little more
yeah.
limited, but it's just the amount of hardware that goes into a game, and the number of processors that you use has just increased tenfold, and the
Mm-hmm.
cooling systems that come with it. I like how this talk has kind of devolved into a back in my day kind of
Yes, exactly.
kind of thing, but it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have all these tools, and yet you're deciding you want to limit yourself to such an extent that it is a chore, it is a labor of love, and a way to, I don't know, just either harken back or just explore to the fullest the medium that has passed
Mm-hmm.
basically 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the computer that I'm going to be getting, the case is going to be smaller. I think this is like an extra large case. It's like a good 20-pound case I have. No, I'm sorry. This is a good like 30-pound case that I have right now, and the one I'm looking at is going to be like a mid-size. And again, it's going to be at least like 10 to 15 times more powerful than what this computer is. And again, we see that with every piece of hardware. Like we were just saying, a smartphone that's like this big is probably more powerful than most consoles back during the 90s.
Oh,
And,
easily.
and Mike's talking about a 200 meg hard drive. I remember the arduous task of putting in, I think it was 2 or 4 megabytes of memory into my old computer back in 1995. 4 megs of RAM. That was, we're playing with the fire there.
Yeah, and just physical media like discs and stuff. I mean, I can't remember the last time I
Mm-hmm.
ran a game off of a disc,
Yeah.
whether it be, Blu-ray or whatever. I just download. I haven't bought a physical
Yeah.
game in years, and that includes console. I haven't actually owned a console in a while, and that brings up news of Xbox or Microsoft
Mm-hmm.
announcing that the Xbox One for 2019 will not have
Mm-hmm.
will not allow physical media, and that's to me it's like, well, so I mean, why hasn't this happened before?
And that's very interesting that you said that, Rob, because I remember we had this conversation. I think I may have had this one like 4 or 5 years ago, back when the Xbox, yeah, it would have been, I think, the Xbox One when it first came out, and they were originally pitching the idea for having a diskless system. That's better. And a lot of people, including myself, complain about how internet connections weren't ready yet. Most people weren't on cable, and it's been a huge mistake. And now we fast forward to today when so many people are now on digital connections and cable. I think my connection's at like 350, 400 meg download, which again most servers don't even support that speed. And now everyone's like, why the hell do we need discs? 6 years ago was, how dare you remove my discs? You're going to kill the game industry. And now everyone's like, no, do it. We want it. We're tired of having all this clutter around.
Yeah, it is definitely clutter. And to even be a collector of older games, you basically have to stuff rooms full
Oh,
of
yes.
giant boxes that have very little inside them.
Mm-hmm. I still have all my Nintendo Powers I've collected on
Oh,
bookshelves
that's
I need to
great.
do something with at some point.
Yeah, that's actually impressive.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I had held on to a few of those from when I was a kid. Like that just the ultimate in
Mm-hmm.
harkening back to the olden times.
Mm-hmm. Back when paper was still popular, right?
Yeah, that's. I mean, I still get Retro Gamer magazine. Well, I don't get it. I buy it whenever I can
Mm-hmm.
at a bookstore. But it is just that physical, that whole physical medium is just it's just an old thing now. I don't know how many people care about their packaging these days in terms of games. Certainly, and you had alluded to this in your podcast,
Mm-hmm.
that built like making that instruction manual is such an important piece of creating an older style of game, a physical game. Nowadays, all of the guides and stuff are online, and you don't have to
Mm-hmm.
worry about it. But yeah, printing out something like that used to be a big deal. I mean, not a big deal. It used to be normal, and now it's a big deal. Now it's unheard of.
Yeah.
And who went out of business recently?
I was about. Yeah, I was just about to say that Prima Games went out of
Yeah,
business. I think there's no more strategy guide companies now.
yeah, and I mean that actually opens up a market for indie publishers to come through and do some strategy guides,
Mm-hmm.
because they can be very terrific guides, and we've talked about like the one I have that's my favorite is Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. Like that is the best strategy guide I've ever seen in
I
my
have that.
life.
I have that one right behind me too.
Yeah, and it's an art form to do a really good strategy guide,
Mm-hmm.
and it I like just buying a strategy guide that looks good despite not having the game sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
And
s-
I think, as you just said, that was a really good point. That it is an art form, just as these retro games are. And I think it's still very hard to get a lot of people to appreciate that, because we've said this before about how a lot of gamers treat video games as just like hardware that when Call of Duty 5 comes out, Call of Duty 4 is now obsolete. You can throw it out. Just like you get the PlayStation 4. Who cares about the PlayStation 3? But we obviously know there's a lot more to it than that. And it is great that we see these retro game companies and just developers who focus on modern retro design still holding a touch for these games, because there is a sense of purity to them. And again, you can make a really great modern retro game. I'm really looking forward to. man, I forget the name of it, from a Joy Master. They're working on, looks like kind of like a Contra take. Let me see. Is it on their site? Oh, here it is. Blazing Chrome is going to be their next game. And it looks very much like Contra 3, which I'm a huge fan of. I'm sure a lot of people on the older side remember that one as well.
Yeah. And there was an article in Gama Sutra that I looked up before our podcast or before our cast here and our stream, and it was about a guy who makes games specifically for a URL bar, which I had never heard of. The concept just even now blows my mind a little bit. To take even further constraints. So basically, the game actually exists in your browser search bar, and it's it just has the URL, and then after like index.com or whatever, it has the game, which is really just minimal. It's just a jumping thing. Like the animation is between an X and a Y, so it looks like someone's kind of running, and then little O's come by, and you have to jump over them. And the concept of having a functional game in a URL bar is nuts. And but this person was messing with code and realized that he could screw with the URL and decided to make a game out of it. And I mean, it's both brilliant and insane at the same time.
And yeah, as you said, that is definitely dealing with constraints for a video game there.
Yes, it is. And it makes you, I think, a more effective programmer because you do have to deal with efficiency. And a lot of programming is about being efficient because even if you don't have constraints in terms of physical media, you do have constraints in terms of what a computer can handle. It kind of does blow my mind a little bit whenever I do run in, like in the games that I work on now, what constraints actually do come up. Because there still is, like, especially on the Nintendo Switch, there's a lot of severe limitations in making a port that comes from a PlayStation. I mean, that is really, hobbling yourself when you take a game and make it for the PS4 or the Xbox and try and put it on the Switch, because it's like it's like cramming something into this tiny little space that operates completely differently than the other systems do.
And that was one of the big things about trying to get cross-platform support for the Wii U, and even with the Wii before then, that there was just such a different console in terms of specifications and controls that most ports were just very lackluster, or developers just didn't really care to try and put it on there when they had the ease of the PlayStation and the Xbox.
Yeah, I mean, the office I work for specifically ports NBA 2K19 to the Switch, and the challenges that go with that are immense. But you manage to do it, and you have to. The graphics are so limited. One of the things that I find most impressive is that, like the Mario games, Zelda, all of those titles are done so perfectly and look better than 90% of any other AAA title on a system that to take a AAA title from the Xbox would make it look terrible. And it really is. It makes you appreciate how efficient the designers and developers of the games specifically for Switch really are.
Yeah. I mean, if anyone knows how the Nintendo Switch works, it's gotta be Nintendo. They are.
Yeah, that's true.
They know how to get like every centimeter of power out of that system. They can do that, and yet it is very impressive to see. And again, going back to our topic of like these kinds of retro games, that these developers who are making games like in like a NES style or SNES, they are pushing it as far as they can. I know Yacht Club has released several talks in the past about working within the limitations of that kind of engine, and even sometimes breaking the engine to try and do something that wouldn't be possible. Like a big example would be a lot of these modern retro games avoid, screen flickering or texture flickering. And that would have been something, or even slow down. Because again, one of the things that we don't hear too much about is that a lot of those older games, there is a ton of slowdown when a lot of stuff gets on screen. For people
Hmm.
who watch speedrunners, they talk about how they have to kill enemies as quickly as possible, or the screen just, begins like a stutter show. And hi, Malwinius.
Yeah, that is exactly the case. I remember, whenever I watch some of these speedruns on older games, I'm like, is that how it really acted? I don't remember it being like that. When in fact that's just how it was, and you just dealt with it. But yeah, you get all the frame, the sprite limitations when they all get on screen. Like you get some of those crazy levels in Metroid,
Mm-hmm.
with everything shooting at you. It starts to chug your system. Things start to flicker and look terrible.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just how it was back then, so it didn't bother you so much. And on a modern screen, that stuff really gets accentuated
Oh,
quite a bit.
yes. Mm-hmm. And I guess let me check our time here. We're about 34 minutes. I think we'll probably move on to another topic in a few minutes. But I guess for you, Rob, and for the audience as well watching, do you tend to find yourself going back to playing, like, do you like to play modern retro games? Or do you want to see, like, games try and push things in a different direction? Like, to give you an example, when I played Mega Man 11 a few weeks ago, I didn't really like that game as much. It got very repetitive for me, considering that they were just really adhering to that old school formula. But I really enjoyed something like Odalis, which, while it did look like an older style like Castlevania game, they did push things in terms of UI and general gameplay.
Yeah, I gotta say, I do appreciate the latter there because, back when we were playing those games, the whole goal was to
Mm-hmm.
expand the game and make it as long and unrepetitive as possible as a developer. And now that we have that ability to go back and make it repetitive just because it's how it felt back then, it seems like a step backward. I appreciate that people would go back and use those systems and try to, squeeze as much as they can out of it. But to take an old design and move it into a modern time, that seems a little tough. The
Mm-hmm.
retro style of art and the pixel art is something I can really appreciate in a game. And it does take a lot of time and it can look really amazing. So I do like a retro game that takes advantage of modern
Mm-hmm.
of modern PCs and modern machines and all of the power you can get out of them. And I think certainly the retro games that are made via things like Game Maker make it easier for a developer to access and make a cool title that they can imagine, but they're not necessarily a programmer to be able to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it is just, I think, very hard for a lot of developers. And I know we've talked about this topic before, with trying to equate that old school doesn't mean just pure difficulty. I know when I spoke with, oh no, what's the name of the company? The ones who publish Locomolito. I see it in my head. I just don't remember off the top of my head. Let's see if I can look it up very quickly. But like games like Locomolito, again, like his games may. Oh, here it is. Abbey Light Studios. When I spoke to their head, one of the programmers, they talked about the fact that while their games are considered this kind of retro design, they're not meant to emulate like the brutally unfair side of it. And I think that's a very hard point for a lot of people to understand, that just because you use committed jumping in something like Curse Castalia or what was his other game, Curse of Izios, that you can still do other things to make those games more enjoyable or more playable. And it takes, again, a very strong eye towards design to get that working.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the reason for the difficulty and repetition back then was to extend the length of
Mm-hmm.
time it took to play a game because they were
Yeah.
still expensive. And in today's dollars, they are more expensive, but than a modern game is. But it really is. It was a challenge to take that and make it longer than a 30-minute experience. So you make a game super difficult. You make a game repetitive just to make sure that the player can enjoy it a little more
Mm-hmm.
fully.
Yep.
Nowadays, to see something that's repetitive or to see something that's super difficult is becomes frustrating. It
Yep.
really truly does. And to Mike's point, like, yeah, I love that stuff back then. It's hard to go back though, having experienced some of the stuff that they've done since.
Yeah. Like I've talked about is when I watched the YouTuber, the Mexican runner, who does his whole NES. He plays. His mission is to play and beat every NES game ever released. And watching him play stuff like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, The Rocketeer. I'm trying to think of a few other really, really bad ones. Oh, Akari Warriors, those kinds of games. And yeah, like I could never go back and play them. I even mentioned this before. Something like XCOM. XCOM may be one of the best games ever made, but it is terrible to go back to today. And again, I would love to talk to Jake Solomon from Firaxis. I would just talk for like 5 hours about everything that they went into trying to make a modern take on that design.
Yeah, yeah, it's very true.
I guess.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, finish your thought.
Oh, I was just gonna kind of round out your thought and just that it's the concept of going back and playing those games it is painful to realize how behind the times, so to speak, that stuff really is compared to today's games.
Yeah. So here's my final question for the section. I'll throw over to you, Rob. For everybody watching this, is there a genre of old school games that you can go back to and play? And then is there a genre that you just flat out refuse? Like, I'd never want to play this kind of game ever again.
Well, I know my answer to that question is I've moved away from platformers mostly because of the old stuff. It's just the old school platformers they were fairly limited, and I appreciate, like, I could go back and play adventure games. Like I was saying earlier that I want to go back and play The Secret of Monkey Island again. I really did. I'd like to even go back and play Zork again, even though as an adventure game, it is very remedial at this point. I mean, it's still got some really strange quirks and difficulties, as an old adventure game does, but it is very, even the storytelling aspect of it is behind, the stuff it's inspired.
I think what's funny is that for myself, Rob, I think I'm the complete opposite. Like, I can still go back and play platformers, but I have no joy in my head to go back and play an old school adventure game. We played not Phantasmagoria, The Seventh Guess last week, and yeah, like. Oh my god, like the puzzles in that game, like they use ye old English to solve a puzzle I've never heard of. I'm like, wait, how was I supposed to know that? It was a solution.
Yeah, dial 1-900 hint line for expensive hints. RPGs, yeah, that's a good one to bring up, Janshevik. It's because those old RPGs were an awful lot of grinding, just tons of it.
I got a funny story about that. A few years ago, I played Phantasy Star 2 for the very first time. It was on one of those Sega Classic collections. And like I said, it didn't come with a manual, so I just played it completely straight. And they started off with just the main character and then like his female friend. And I got about halfway through the game thinking, oh my god, this game is impossible. How am I supposed to play this with two characters? And then, like, just as for the lore, I went back to like the character's home. And then I discovered that they unlock new characters that you can get from their home, and I had no idea. All of a sudden, I was like, wait a minute, I could have had a party of 4 for the last 4 hours of play, and nobody told me? Oh my god, I never played Indiana Jones Adventures. I think that was one of the games that, no, there was Indiana Jones games for the NES that I saw the Mexican runner play. I was like, no, I don't want to do that. Nope, I pass. Hands up, I don't want to do that one.
I do have to say, I've been itching to go back and play Maniac Mansion through Day of the Tentacle, mostly because it's one of those first games that allows you to pick a variety of characters, pick from a variety of characters, and your ending changed, and the solving of puzzles changed depending on your combo, which was just incredible. And it's still not done today because it's so difficult.
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure we ever get Ron Gilbert back on. You can probably talk about the nightmare of making that game. What was another one? Oh yeah, going back to RPGs. Yeah, I still would love to play through the Seventh Saga. We talked about this on either stream or on the Discord channel, and that's another old school style one. And yeah, a lot of these games, it's just very hard for them to hold up, but there's still that charm in them.
Yeah, it is absolutely true. There is a charm there. I know trying to introduce my nieces to an old school game, they would probably just laugh at me and just say, "Why on earth would you play this?" But there is a lot there that inspired modern games, and it's interesting to go back and see how that happened. At least, especially having lived through it. I know as someone who only experienced modern games, it probably is not all that interesting.
Mm-hmm. And
Walkthrough. There you go. That's a good way to do
exactly.
it.
And I know we talked about. I don't think we mentioned this last time, but right now I'm enjoying Dusk and Ion Maiden, which are two throwbacks for first-person shooter fans. I know Ion Maiden is built on. I always forget the name of this. The game engine that was used for Duke Nukem back in the day. Maybe it's on their store page. And Dusk just literally looks like an old school pixel-driven FPS.
Yeah.
Let's see, what was the name of that engine? It's going to drive me nuts if I don't look it up.
You just remind me of Heretic. It was one of those Doom clones that came out a few years after that. You could actually fly in that game. It was so amazing.
Here it is, the Build engine. It was used on Duke Nukem, Shadow Warrior, and Blood. Which I have Blood. I bought that off of, I think, GOG or off of Steam. I still haven't had a chance to play through it. Oh, Hexen. Yeah, I remember that one. A first-person shooter with RPG elements to it. That was pretty kooky as well. But, yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting to see. And there's a greater discussion to be had about how developers are trying to mine for nostalgia, especially with the NES Classics, PlayStation Classic, and stuff like that. But considering we are 45 minutes in just for this one topic, I think we'll save that for another time. Maybe we'll do that for next week if we're all still awake from Thanksgiving about mining nostalgia there. Yeah, I know that, Jan. That's a strange thing. I've never, like, this is my final point. Seriously, this will be my final point, and I'll shut up and let Rob finish it off. But the weirdest thing for me was I could play those old school shooters. They didn't bother me one bit. But I could never play the Game Boy, the original, colorless, no light Game Boy, without getting severe migraines from like eye strain on that.
Yeah, I never had that problem. Fortunately, the Game Boy had some of my favorite games in the world, and Super Mario Land, and in particular, was a very unique Mario game, a platformer that I think has just gotten forgotten to the sands of time. Look it up on YouTube. It's interesting because Mario starts flying airplanes and submarines, and I think in the sequel he goes in space. And then there's no hint of like some of the old bosses. Even it's just weirdness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was one I only played for like 10 minutes. Like back then, I basically had to have like a little clock next to me. I could only play a game with for maybe 10 to 15 minutes at a time. Anything more, and I would just start to get this pounding migraine right in my temple. So when they introduced the Super Game Boy Color, that was a revelation for me. And then when we finally got the GBA, or I'm sorry, not the GBA, the GBA Lite, when it actually had like the internal backlight on there, that was a game changer for me.
Yeah, all those little features definitely, because you couldn't play Game Boy at night or in the dark.
God. Yeah, that's another thing for all the new kids playing their smartphones and having, internal lighting, all you young whippersnappers out there.
This is the old heads game discussion.
Exactly. We don't need Fortnite, right? Who cares
No.
about that here? I know. Let's demake Fortnite for the
God.
Intellivision. That will be our next project right there.
Yeah, use a modem to play online.
But I've done enough talking to wrap things up. So Rob, I'll throw it over to you. Do you have any final thoughts? Oh God, the Virtual Boy. I only played it for 5 minutes once, and I never want to do that one again.
Oh, the Virtual Boy, and playing it in a Blockbuster video because I would never buy it on my own. Oh, Blockbuster Video. Gosh. All
That's
right.
another oldie right
That's
there.
enough. That's. I'm gonna just go in a spiral. So I'll
Mm-hmm.
stop talking. I think that's enough for me.
All right. All right.